Trek.fm.
This is J.G. Hertzler, General Martok on Deep Space Nine, and you're listening to Trek.fm.
Welcome, Niners, to another episode of The Orb, our dedicated Deep Space Nine podcast. I'm Christopher Jones, and with me, as he always is my esteemed co-host, Matthew Rushing. And Matthew, you look like you could use an iced Ractigino this morning.
Chris, I absolutely could use a nice Ractigino today, and so please send one my way. It's definitely, of course, your morning, I'm evening, so of course if I drink one now, I won't be asleep till probably like 4 a.m., so I guess we better make that a decaf Ractigino. Do they make decaf Ractigino?
That is a good question. Somehow I have a feeling that warriors would kind of frown upon the idea of something that's decaf because you're taking the warrior spirit out of the beverage.
I think you're absolutely right on that, Chris. It just feels very un-Klingon to have decaf anything.
I think so. But Quark is already preparing some, to kind of win some points with Jadzia, and I think he'll pass one your way anyway. But today we are going to be talking about the 8th episode of Deep Space Nine Season 1 as we continue our 30th anniversary rewatch. This is The Passenger, and here is a very quick rundown. Dr. Bashir's arrogance is interrupted when the runabout Rio Grande receives a distress call from a Kobliad transport. They find a fire aboard the ship and 2 people in distress. They rescue one and fail to save the other, or so it seems. When they return to Deep Space Nine with the surviving Kobliad, a security officer named Ty Kajada, they find themselves caught up in a mystery as strange things begin happening aboard the station. Kajada believes the other passenger on her ship, the criminal scientist Rao Vantika, is still alive and responsible. So, Matthew, just before we get started, I want to warn you, if I start acting strangely at any point today, just know that it's probably not me. It's the other being who is using part of the massive unused area of my brain as a humanoid. There's a lot of real estate available there. So anyway, let's get going here talking about this episode. And I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are, because this episode for me, it's one of those where we're doing this rewatch, and even though I've seen DS9 over and over and over and over and over, it's not one of those that sticks in my head like Vantika would. As, I remember everything that happens in that story, and it's one that I want to go back to see. And interestingly, just as we were starting to record here, Justin Oser, former host here on the network, replied to my tracked notification on Mastodon that I'm watching this episode and said it's one of the few episodes in the first season that he skips when he does rewatches. And I think a lot of people maybe feel that way about this episode. So what do you think? Maybe starting from the opening and the extreme arrogance of Bashir as he's talking to Kira.
I think that probably has something to do with why people don't respond to this episode. I mean, Bashir is very arrogant in this episode, and I think that can be quite a frustration for people. This is an episode, too, for Bashir in a lot of ways that gives him some humility, which is a good thing. It teaches him some humility. And, it's funny because, we're doing this rewatch and we've seen the episode many times, and we've seen the series many times, both you and I. And so as I rewatch this episode, I always think of and kind of in my head canon is this idea that Bashir is overdoing his arrogance to make up for the fact that he's genetically enhanced. And so I think that reading makes it a little bit better for me.
Yeah.
But it is still, Bashir here is just kind of an obnoxious character. And, I love the character, especially who he becomes. But in all honesty, who he is here is not great. He's kind of a frustrating person to deal with. And in many ways, you feel like Kira, which I appreciate that the episode does, right? It has another character roll their eyes at someone, and because they're behaving so obnoxiously and they're oblivious to the fact that they are so obnoxious. And so all of that, I think, is actually really good about the episode. And I think in many ways that it's another place where Deep Space Nine is demarcating itself from TNG, because you didn't really see that very often in TNG, I don't think, especially Starfleet characters being obnoxious in this way, unless they were a Badmiral. And then, of course, anything was legal at that point when you're writing a Badmiral. But, I can also understand why someone might skip this episode. And mainly it's just because once you do know the mystery, it's not quite as interesting an episode, because you already know what's going to happen. And there isn't too much else here in the episode that is like character driven, or a lot of, you're not getting a lot of character development or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I think that's the other reason why people might do that as well.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to come back to that in just a moment. But first, I just want to comment on the arrogance of Bashir here at the beginning. And I wonder sometimes with this episode if it's done intentionally to create a contrast for what happens with the character of Bashir through the episode and then to the end. But what it feels more like to me is it feels like that very early Bashir, like emissary, like a man alone, past prologue, those very early episodes where the initial concept of Bashir is that he's this, he's this very intelligent medical student who's graduated, and he's very proud of himself, and he's got this big ego, and he's this ladies' man, or he wants to be. And it feels like that's really being played up here when that aspect of the character has already started to settle down through the episodes that have led up to this. And it almost feels like a reversion back to that original idea of Bashir. But it doesn't sit well with me the way it's portrayed right there at the beginning. But the mystery part, that's a big part I want to talk about, because like you said, once you know the mystery, I don't really feel like this one holds up very well on a second viewing, and certainly not on a third, fourth, fifth, sixth viewing like we do. And on our outline, I titled this Dead Giveaways, because I really feel like Siddig is, his portrayal of the character throughout this episode, particularly if you know the mystery, he's just giving it away all the way through. Now, he has said that this was very hard for him because he got the script like a day before. Didn't have time to really get a grasp on the character and such the way that you would want to as an actor. And also, apparently, all the parts where he is Vantika, they re-recorded all the dialogue because he did an accent that they didn't like, and they went back and they re-recorded it all, and they they dubbed the audio for all that section. And I think that's probably a reflection of the fact that it was done on a very compressed time frame, and he didn't have the time to really absorb the concept and the character the way that he would want to. That's what it seemed like from, comments that he's made and then what I'm watching on the screen. But I feel like even from the moment when they're back on the station and they're in the infirmary and Vantika's body is laid out and Bashir is talking to Kajada, and when she stabs Vantika, the reaction of Bashir kind of gives it away that on the one hand, okay, he's shocked that she's just stabbed this corpse, but at the same time, you get the feeling, once you know it's actually Vantika inside Bashir, you feel like, oh, that's Vantika's reaction, right?
Right.
And then when she says she wants a complete autopsy and so forth, and he says, oh, is that really necessary? The facial expression during that, too, is like, I'm going to be busted. Don't want that to happen. And then I just feel throughout the episode that it's really quite clear what's going on, especially on a second watch. So it doesn't hold up as well as a lot of DS9 episodes. Yeah. I feel like they hold up really well even after 20 viewings. And this is one that I feel doesn't.
Yeah, no, I can't agree with that more. I mean, I think everything that you mentioned is something that is a little bit off about the episode. The portrayal there from Sadig, I think, is very strange and, of course, feels very stilted, which, you could say, oh, well, it's somebody sharing your brain and they're forcing words out of your mouth and all that kind of stuff. So you can put yourself in that mindset and get there in that way. But, I think overall, this whole part of the story, at least with just the portrayal and everything that happens with it, is just not up to the standard that we're used to, even here in season 1.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, though, is that I do think on the other side, this is a very sci-fi idea, right?
Oh, yeah.
The idea that you could, transplant your consciousness into another person. Actually, this is a great sci-fi idea here. I think what's the problem is just kind of wrapped in an episode where the rest of it isn't executed in the way that you would want it to be executed to really feel as though this is working on all cylinders.
Well, let me ask you about that, because this episode was written by Morgan Gandale, who wrote The Inner Light on The Next Generation. And he had said that his original concept for the story was not for Vantika to be hiding in Bashir's brain, but rather for Vantika to be hiding in Kajada, the way that the crew thinks is going on early on as they're doing their investigation. And the reason for that is that he thought it would be interesting to have, you've got a cop chasing a criminal, and then the criminal is actually occupying part of the cop's mind. And so that idea of, the cop robber, but they become one.
Yeah.
And, that's an interesting science fiction concept, like you're saying. And then eventually that is figured out, and Vantika comes back out, and then they have a chase. And then the thing about the arrogant Bashir at the beginning is that I mentioned it feels sort of like that kind of ladies' man, like when he's telling the Bajoran woman about his graduation and he missed the one question, that kind of bragging about himself. And part of Gendell's original story too would be that Bashir is falling for Kajada, and then he has to make a decision at the end of whether he's going to trust her or not, and that helps save the station and capture Vantika. And so the Bashir element of the original idea of the story was different than this. Do you think that would have made a more interesting story than having it be one of our main crew that gets possessed by this criminal?
I think that does feel like a better story, especially when you think about the idea of, if this is going to be kind of a Bashir episode and kind of give him a traumatic incident here to deal with. Especially here, he's excited about being on the final frontier of medicine and all this, and then to have this all kind of go horribly wrong, I think is much more interesting. It is kind of strange that they did change it, and I wonder if and see, the beauty of this is that you could do the misdirection where you actually think it's Bashir, and it turns out to be Kajada. Mainly too because he could have touched both of them and everything. And so it creates the ambiguity. You're not really sure. And maybe both characters are doing things that are somewhat suspicious. And, so I think there's many ways to I think, make this better. And unfortunately, it's not great. And so, yeah. And I think when I think about this too, so far, this is the one episode that we've come across where I'm really more critical, and I'm in the rewatch where I'm just like, it just isn't quite hitting the levels that we've been getting even in this rewatch. And so, I got to give it credit because it's the first season of a show, and if this is the one where I'm like, it doesn't all quite work, even though, again, as we mentioned, there's some great ideas here. There's some interesting thought processes for Bashir, and so a little bit of character movement and growth there. You have some fun stuff with Quark and Dax as well. There's some little nuggets in here and there, but I think the main thrust of the story is something that just doesn't quite pan out the way that they wanted it to, and I can't be too upset here in the first season of Deep Space Nine. If that's what are we? This is the 6th, 7th episode
this
or
is
something?
The 8th, yeah.
The 8th, okay, gosh, 8th episode. And this is the first one where I'm just like, you know what? I probably wouldn't really necessarily do this in a rewatch if I do another rewatch, which I will, right? And this is, Justin Ozer is got a point there. I think this might just be one that I might skip in the future just because I've seen it enough times to know what happens and know what happens character-wise, and there's just not necessarily enough to do that, except the Odo story. Yeah.
Well, Matthew, what kind of fool are you?
I'm my own special kind.
I love that line. That's one that, while I say I don't really think about this episode much and remember the details all that much, most of the time, that line I do. Because it just sums up Odo so well.
It's a great line, too. So,
my own special variety. Okay, well, so the Odo storyline, let's talk about that a bit. We've got Lieutenant George Primmin, who comes on. I like to think he's prim and proper here, at least after Sisko sets him straight. And, he's there because Colm Meaney was going off to do a movie, and this is something that Colm does throughout DS9, right? Like, he sometimes would go off and do movies, so they have to kind of work around that, and they knew that he wasn't going to be around for some episodes, and they wanted to have another character on who the crew can talk with, and so they had come up with this idea of Lieutenant Primmin, and we get him here, and then we get him again and move along home. But that's it. And the concept, though, of Primmin resurfaces again later in the form of Michael Eddington. And this idea of Starfleet not trusting Odo and Sisko having to kind of balance Starfleet and Odo's feelings is something that recurs through the series. But this is our first moment where we deal with that. So how do you think Primmin worked as the character for that?
I think I actually enjoy the character. I think he's an interesting character. I think one of the things about him that is interesting is the way that he does challenge Odo. But what I think is nice about the story is the way in which he creates for Odo a foil but he becomes a character who quickly connects with Odo, sees the ability to learn from Odo. He gets put in his place thinking, oh, I'm all that in a bag of chips.
Mm-hmm.
And then it turns out not only does Odo know what he's doing, but he takes from Odo what he learns from him and actually helps the investigation, which I think is awesome, and I thought the actor was a good choice. I enjoyed his performance in the episode, which is interesting because he's a juxtaposition against Bashir and his arrogance. Bashir, it takes quite a bit to put him in his place, whereas with Primmin, he very quickly, once he gets the talking to from Cisco, I like to call it the Cisco talking to, he goes and apologizes to Odo and then does all he can to make good on that apology in the sense of becomes a different person, and I thought that this was all again, to me, this is the best part of the episode, and I think it's actually really well done, and it is an interesting theme that's going to get played out again, because even though Cisco himself might trust Odo, it does make sense as to why Starfleet would have a harder time doing that.
Yeah.
Right? Because they are not living day in and day out with this person, and there's so much about Odo that is still a complete mystery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree on that. The other thing I feel, though, with Primmin coming in is that he reminds me a little bit of Bashir in Emissary, where he's coming into this Bajoran station. It's in the wilderness from the perspective of Starfleet officers and of humans. Primmin even comments on the fact that it took him 3 weeks to get there, and he hopes it's not all for nothing. I feel like he comes in at first sort of looking down on everyone a bit like, hey, I'm Starfleet. I know how to do everything. And you guys are just, you're these Bajorans over here, and this Odo guy, we don't know what he is. And I can't believe you're not doing things the way that we were taught to do them at the academy. And what I like about the scene with Cisco and Primmin is that I think it says a lot about Cisco and his adjustment to being aboard the station, because he also didn't want to be there at first. But when Primmin starts complaining about how Odo let Quark know about the shipment, and Cisco says, it's hard to keep a secret in a place like this. It's not a starship. And Primmin says he understands that, but then he says, it's not the way they taught us at the academy, if you want my opinion. And then Cisco says, actually, I don't. And I loved that line.
That was awesome.
But what I really like is he says, you and I are guests of the Bajorans. You don't have to forget what you learned at the academy. You just don't throw it in anyone's face here.
Right, exactly.
And, it shows that Cisco is already adjusting to the fact that things are different here, and it's not a Starfleet station. They have been invited there by the Bajorans, and he reflects that Star Trek value of learning to respect another culture and to assimilate yourself into that culture instead of judging it and trying to bend it into the way you want things. It's something,
Exactly.
I feel, because I've lived in Japan for so long, for more than half my life at this point, and I see a lot of people who just arrived here a year ago or 2 years ago, pandemic notwithstanding. Things are a little bit different right now, but I see people who have not been here very long. And the attitude often is to try to bend the society to the way you think everything should be, instead of you assimilating yourself into the society because you're one person and the society is not going to change for you, right? You have to learn to live within the place that you've chosen to live. And Sisko reflects that here, and then Primmin doesn't. But like you say, Primmin very quickly goes and apologizes to Odo in a way that I felt was a little bit overdone. The message was well received. I think that probably in reality, he wouldn't have been quite so apologetic in the way that he delivered the lines. But the way he delivered the lines is part of the reasons I'm not really crazy about the Primmin character. I feel like James Lashley, the actor portraying Primmin, he has this kind of folky, laid-back way of speaking that, for me, I don't know, it just, something doesn't quite feel right for the character. And I think maybe it's a character that if Primmin had become a recurring character and had been on the show, 10 times or something, probably Lashley would have settled in to the role and into the character in a way that felt better to me. But here in the first appearance, it's hard, right? I mean, you're coming in to an established, it's still young, but an established cast at this point, 8 episodes in, and you're bringing in a new character. So I get that, but I'm not crazy about Primmin, and I'm personally glad that he did not become part of the series ongoing.
I do think he has quite an interesting way of speaking. As you were mentioning that, I was kind of thinking to myself that he has a more like Trip Tucker vibe,
but
slightly
without
more
the
like
charisma of Trip Tucker.
Right. I just meant like, there's almost like a southern, almost gentlemanly nature to the character, which I think is interesting, especially when you think of the idea of him being in security and kind of being like the nice town sheriff kind of guy. And I think he would have grown into the series for sure. And of course, this is not a character that becomes recurring. So we don't really have an opportunity to do that. But to me, he didn't bother me, and I didn't really have an issue with the portrayal personally. And I think part of it was just, this was the more interesting part of the story in the rewatch because of what it does and how it affects Odo. But, otherwise, it's an idea that they'll pick up later on and move the ball with it in a way that's, I think, much more substantial for the character, too, of Odo. And, of course, with Michael Eddington, it becomes much more substantial for Sisko as well.
Right. Yeah, and it has wide-reaching implications for the DS9 storyline and for where Odo's concerned, right? So,
exactly.
Yeah, I agree that in terms of interesting plots in this episode, yeah, the Primmin Odo one is the one that I actually care about because it affects things beyond this episode in a way that really none of the other elements of the story do. One thing I put in my notes, I'm mostly joking, but I liked when they were discussing what to do about Kajada, and Odo says, I could assign some personnel to maintain continuous surveillance of Kajada, and Primmin pipes in, we're already stretched to the limit preparing for the shipment. And then I felt like he was sort of like, why don't I just do the bare minimum and half-ass my job by letting the computer watch where Kajada goes and just let us know if anything weird happens? It's like, I'll just hang back here.
Well, and it's not as though the problem is with that is that the computer can only track you if you have a comm badge on correctly.
Which is part of the plot point, right?
Exactly,
later on.
Exactly.
So. Because that's a very common thing in Star Trek throughout at least TNG on, when they have the comm badges where, you just leave your comm badge behind somewhere. Actually, when I was watching this, I was picturing that if this were a show set in our current year, people would just leave their phone behind somewhere, right? So that they cannot be tracked.
Exactly.
They'll go in the infirmary. It's like, I found Dr. Bashir's iPhone in here. He's not here.
Oh, man.
But I do like when Jadzia asks the computer, where is Dr. Bashir? And the computer says, Dr. Bashir is in the infirmary. And then she's like, wait, where? Like, is he hiding in the closet, or where is he?
Just again, yeah, he's probably just hiding in the supply closet. He just needed a little me time,
Yeah, exactly. All right. I guess one other thing I wanted to ask you about is the ending, because it happens very quickly. And Kajada asks Sisko, I assume you're going to return custody of the prisoner to me. And Sisko does. And then she immediately destroys this little device that's holding the essence of Vantika. And so it's an execution of a prisoner right in front of everyone. And Sisko certainly seems shocked. But going back to what I was saying about his conversation with Primmin, and how you can tell that Sisko in his time on the station already is really learning that different cultures have different ways of doing things, and you cannot immediately judge it based on your own way, in this case as Starfleet officers. Obviously he's shocked. He doesn't say anything, though, and I just felt there was a connection there that was different than maybe what we would have seen on Star Trek before. But it all happens so quickly, and then it's over.
No, I think it is an interesting end to the episode. And what I like about it is how different it is from a TNG episode. And I think this might be the best part of the episode in the sense of showing how different it is than TNG. That we're going to have a ambiguous end. We're going to have a very gray end. There's no black and white here. It's absolutely shades of gray. And what's interesting is that when you think of Kajada having spent most of her life chasing this person, and this person doing everything they can to get away, and to get away with murder and more, there's a sense of justice in it, right? When we see that, because we've heard about what this person has done and the way that they've escaped justice so many times. And so this might be a place where I think the episode actually somewhat redeems itself in creating a end to which, as a Star Trek fan, I don't think at that point you were thinking was going to happen. I mean, now with, things that have happened in Discovery, and this is not a shock to people, that they would actually be expecting it. But I think for the 90s Star Trek, this is not what you see coming.
Right. Yeah, that's the thing at the time. Now maybe when you look back, it's not so surprising. But, Michael Piller had said that he felt this episode didn't quite work on DS9 because he felt it could easily be a TNG episode with Geordi in the place of Bashir. I don't know. Like, this thing that we're talking about here at the end is one reason why I don't feel like that would have necessarily worked on TNG, because I don't think this is the ending that we would have gotten. But even before this,
right,
I have a little bit of a hard time seeing this as a TNG episode. I do think it feels a little bit off in general. As a DS9 episode, it doesn't quite stick the landing. It feels like this. It's hard to put into words. There's something about the pacing, the portrayals, the dialogue, that all just feels a little bit off. But I do think it feels more like a DS9 episode than a TNG episode.
No, I 100% agree with you on that. And, I think you're correct in the way you're framing it, that it is more of a Deep Space Nine episode, but it's still just not quite what we've come to expect in the execution of an episode. And therefore, that's, I think, the thing that kind of leaves you in this place where it's like, oh, I can see some good here, but I also I'm not getting the same sense of, in some ways, satisfaction of watching the episode that I have been in the previous episodes. And I think more importantly, and we've called it out already, is that this is an episode to which doesn't have as much rewatchability as many of the Deep Space Nine episodes that we've come to know and love. And even here in this first season, it doesn't have that either. And so therefore, it's not hitting the bar that we've come to expect, which is, yeah, even in a rewatch, I'd want to rewatch this episode.
Yeah. Well, those sound like final thoughts. So what's your rating on this one?
Yeah, I think with this one, I'm going to give it a 2.5 out of 5 ice ractogenos, because it doesn't quite reach above average, really, as an episode. I don't think it's a terrible episode. I just don't think that it has what we've come to look for. And again, it's not one that I would, probably go back and rewatch anytime soon. So what about you, Chris? Where are you going to land?
Well, final thoughts for me, I think I've probably pretty much summed it up there before what you shared at the end. There were 2 things I wanted to mention, 2 references in here, which I did think were fun. One is a reference to Spock and McCoy when Bashir says that it seems sort of like synaptic pattern displacement, but he's never heard of that being done by a non-Vulcan, which is a reference to Spock passing his Katra to McCoy. So I thought that was fun. And then also, when they have the computer problem and they find out that everything in active memory has been purged from the computers, Kajada says that Vantika did the same thing on Rigel 7. And so Rigel 7, if you look back, Rigel 7 is the planet where we see the fortress, the castle fortress in the cage when Pike is having the memories of the mission. And then looking forward, in terms of recent things for us in Picard, Rigel 7 is the planet where the Enterprise D was when they were on the mission and they thought their communications were compromised, and so they developed the Myriad encryption. So yes, nice. I like the Rigel 7 mentions here in the episode. And then as for a rating, I'm just going to give this one 4 glial cells.
Nice. Okay.
All right, everyone. We would love to hear your thoughts on The Passenger. There are many ways for you to share those with us. Perhaps the best way is to go to Facebook and join the Babel Conference. That is our listeners group. It's there to extend the conversations beyond the podcast. And we've been getting some good chatter on our Artificial Tango episodes where we're talking Picard. And we'd love to see that happening for DS9 as well. So if you'd like to share your thoughts with us and fellow listeners, just go to Facebook and type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field, or the whole name, the Babel Conference. It is a closed group, so if you're joining for the first time, please do answer the questions and agree to the rules of the forum so that I can let you in. You'll find a post for this episode there on the timeline, and you can share your comments with us right there. You can also send us an email if you like. Just go to our website, Trek.fm/contact. Use the form you find there. Choose to send to a show and choose the orb, and that will come to Matthew and me by email. And of course, you can find us everywhere in social media. Our username is Trek.fm. And if your podcast app of choice allows you to leave a rating and a review, we'd love to get that from you as well. And thank you to everyone who has rated us and reviewed us. We really appreciate that. Now, Matthew, when you're not figuring out how to hide yourself away in someone else's brain, where can people find you?
Well, Chris, you just never know where I'm going to pop up, but you can find me all over social media under the name MattRushing02. I am most active on places like Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, and Vero, all under the same name. Of course, here on the network, we've got the 602 Club going, where we are talking about all of those fandoms we love outside of Star Trek. Also, like you mentioned, we're doing the Artificial Tango, and we're having a blast talking about Star Trek Picard Season 3. It's just been so good. I can't wait for the next episode. You can also find us doing Warp 5, which is our 20th anniversary rewatch of Star Trek Enterprise. We've also got Saddle Up, about Strange New Worlds, which will be coming back soon. And I'm doing literary treks about the books and the comics of Star Trek with Casey Pettit. Over on the Nerd Party Network, you'll find me doing Owlpost, which is a Harry Potter podcast about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time. And Aggressive Negotiations with John Mills, talking about Star Wars each and every week. And Chris, when you're not trying to figure out where you can get the perfect iced Raktajino, where can people find you?
I do love a good one. But as we discussed a week or two ago, I like mine with oat milk, not Targ milk. So just waiting for Quark to get that shipment in. Odo's keeping his eye on it. He's suspicious that it's not actually oat milk, but yeah. Now, you can find me here on the network. As you mentioned, you and I do all those shows together. Larry Nemechek and I do the Ready Room from time to time, and you can find me in many episodes in the back catalog. And when I'm not doing that, I'm busy with all my other creative work here in Tokyo, doing magazines and such. But if you'd like to chat, you can find me in social media. My username everywhere is C. Bryan Jones, letter C, and Bryan with a Y. Twitter is where I'm most active. You can also find me on Mastodon on the Trekkies.social instance. And I'd love to chat with you there. If you'd like to help us keep this show and everything that we're doing here on the network going, we could really use your help to find out how to get involved, become an associate producer, get involved in other ways. Just visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM. And we'd like to send a huge thank you to everyone who's supporting us right now. We would not be able to put these podcasts out there without your help. So thank you so very much. Well, Matthew, we've finally reached the moment that we've been waiting for. So I hope you can practice your hopscotch before next time, because we're going to be moving along home.
Well, Chris, I cannot wait to move along home with you. And we want to thank everybody for joining us as well. And we will see you next time as we gaze into the orb.